So, my mom always told me that a pastor should never talk about politics. And if I'm honest, I try not to read or follow the news more than I have to because, frankly, it's not all that encouraging. Um, but at the same time, I want to know what's going on so I know how to pray and how to speak to others and just know what's going on in conversations. And something, especially over the last several months, that we've seen in the news is, I think, pretty clearly the mistreatment of immigrants and refugees. I think that from a Christian perspective, which is what I want to offer in this video, from a Christian perspective, you can have different views on whether we should totally open up our borders or whether it should be harder to get into the US. I live in the US, so I'm speaking from that perspective. You can have one of those positions or one of the many, many positions in between. However, as a Christian, I think a position that, biblically speaking, you can't hold is that we should be unkind to immigrants and refugees, whether documented or undocumented, that we should treat them poorly, that we should not love them, essentially. That's not a Christian position. The Bible's incredibly clear that human beings are made in the image of God, right? It's the famous statement from Genesis 1. The problem is that, at least currently in the US, many who are especially undocumented, but also some documented immigrants and refugees, are not being treated as if they are human beings made in the image of God. And that is a problem. That is something that both government and citizens should not be doing. Now, again, I'm not specifically trying to say, oh, we need this exact policy in place. What I am saying is that the way we treat people, right, whether they're being detained by ICE or whether they're being questioned or whatever it is, the way we treat people should reflect the fact that they're made in the image of God. And that in both the Old and New Testament, we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so it's incredibly heartbreaking to see. And I think it breaks the heart of God. Just as in Egypt before the Exodus, the Israelites were sojourners, you may even say immigrants, coming over. I think initially you could categorize them as refugees in the time of Jacob and the patriarchs. And then to see Egypt mistreat them, I think it's not a perfect one-to-one parallel, but we do see some parallels, right? It is wrong and sinful for a government to mistreat immigrants and refugees. We know that Jesus tells us that, depending on how you interpret it, one of the greatest commands is to love our neighbor as ourselves. There he's quoting Leviticus 19, if I remember right, verse 18. And what we often miss is that later on in Leviticus 19, just a few verses down, in verses 33 and 34, and this is something different scholars have pointed out and reminded us of. Recently I read a piece by New Testament scholar Scott McKnight pointing this out. But in Leviticus 19:33 and 34, it tells us to love the sojourner or foreigner. The Hebrew word is ger. You may even translate it as immigrant or migrant, to love the ger as ourselves. We need to consider that. In this country, it does not look like many Americans, including the current president and administration, are loving the immigrants as themselves. And thus it's not a biblical stance that they're taking. Throughout the Bible, we see numerous examples of what, again, in modern American English language, we would call immigrants and refugees. A common example is the person of Ruth in the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. She and her family encounter a famine in her land and have to go to a different country. That's like a textbook example of a refugee. We see something similar happening in the New Testament with Jesus and Mary and Joseph having to flee the evil wrath of King Herod and go to Egypt for a time. It's being a refugee. And so if Jesus himself was a refugee, at least for a time in his life, and if he commands us to look at the poor and the needy and the naked and imprisoned as if they were he himself, and to love them as if they were he himself, we have to ask if we're doing that. So I guess my point in all of this is that a biblical position on immigration is loving the immigrants and refugees that cross into our lands as if they were ourselves. And especially when they suffer as if they were Christ himself, because they are made in the image of God. And that God identifies himself with the poor and the oppressed. I think it's something that breaks God's heart. And I think it's something that if we're to ask if the Trump administration's current immigration policies and actions are biblical, I think it's pretty clear that they're not. And again, I don't say that as somebody who's super far on the left or something like that. I say that as a Christian. I say that as somebody who studies the Bible and theology, and they're not biblical. So if you find yourself agreeing with me, agreeing with my assessment of the Bible's take on immigration, I just want to offer a few practical points, things I'm far from perfect at, but I think it's good not just to think and talk about this, but to actually act on it. One is to pray. The Bible makes it clear that we should be praying for those in leadership, and I think that's a huge and important thing. Prayer is not just talking at the ceiling, but it's interacting with our loving Father who is the King of the universe. And that's really powerful, and powerful things can happen. So pray for those in leadership, like Paul says. Pray for those who are suffering, for the immigrants and refugees. Pray for those who are in ministries and government organizations and such who are there to serve them. Pray for their strength and well-being too. Another thing is how you talk and speaking up at times. This is really hard for me. I'm not naturally a very bold person. But to speak up, and whether, this doesn't mean we get into huge arguments all the time, calling out lies or injustice, or things like that, and just using our words to actually lift others up and to glorify God. And then a final thing is, to whatever extent you're able, to actually get involved. If you have immigrants and refugees in your area that you're able to serve, you can go serve. Maybe you want to, maybe you're looking for some sort of way to stand up for them publicly, maybe advocating for some kind of social change, or maybe there's a charity or a missions organization, or whatever it is that you want to give to, and actually put your money where your mouth is and support them in that way. In all this, the point is to love our neighbors as ourselves, to treat human beings who are made in the image of God as such, and when needed, to call out authorities who are not doing what God says they should be doing. Not saying we need to have a theocracy or something like that, but what I am saying is that God has put authorities into their positions of power, and so we should pray for them. But like John the Baptist, we should also call them out when they do wrong. But in all this, the emphasis should be on love and pursuing goodness and justice for all people, because God loves us all, and He made us all in His image.